Hello. Welcome all you regular guests, and welcome to the people that are going to see it later on in the rebroadcast. I've planned a special show tonight, podcast show, whatever you want to call it, an AIM Cats Conclave entry, Magnum Malum Exposé. And this is part one. And it was my intention because Reverend David, who is too busy in his church activities today to be able to join us. And so I thought I'd bring on a guest, a very good friend of mine, Christopher Earl Strunk. But he hasn't appeared as of yet. And I'm sure he'll show up sooner or later. But that's okay, because I'm never at a loss for words, or rarely ever. But in that regard, this title might throw some people. Magnum Malum, what does that mean? Well, the nickname for New York City is the Big Apple. And translate that into Latin, and it's Magnum Malum. And the Latin word for apple is malum, which is also, by the way, the word for evil. And so it ties it into the whole nexus of the Garden of Eden and the serpent with the apple to Eve. And so that's kind of an interesting take on New York City, an inside joke, so to speak. And you wonder who came up with the nickname the Big Apple, or Apple Corporation for that matter. What's up with that? And I don't want to get into too much on that, because that wasn't a point of interest today. Today I thought it'd be interesting if we could talk regarding some of the backstory regarding a lot of the machinations that go on in the world. We're going to dispense with current events, because that's what everybody's talking about, and we're going to try and develop the backstory regarding how we got here, where we are now, and because that's a story that hasn't been told enough, because it hasn't been rendered generally accessible. And that's by intention, based upon the research that I've been able to do over the last 45, 50 years. It goes back to a large extent when I was managing the world's largest metaphysical, esoteric, alternative, holistic bookstore in the world. And I was able to meet many authors and had just incredible experience in being able to build a foundation of research, which I have continued on from that time. As many of you know, I created a relational database for Egyptology and Mesopotamian studies in excess of 15,000 volumes. It was a reference database where you could look up a subject and tell you what books would discuss that subject. So that gave me a background of sorts in the ancient world. And if you connect that to the data program system that I set up for one of the largest esoteric libraries, so I have a wide context in which I observe these things. And consequently, I hear a lot of people attempting to speak regarding other podcasters, attempting to approach some of these subjects that I've spent a great many years on. And I stubbed my toe on more than a few occasions. But it's people want closure, and they want to develop an idea, and they want to find closure so that they can complete the thought, and it gives them a sense of satisfaction. Aha, I figured it out. Well, and many times you may have just figured out part of it. The world is an open set, it's not a closed set, so you can't radically assume that you have all the relevant material at your disposal. There's things you don't know, and you have to always leave room for that. And that's the spirit of the quest. That's the whole manner in which I attempt to approach things, to try and not let my observations be obfuscated by sympathy or antipathy. And that's a challenge, you know. And I fail, like most people, to be able to meet the mark of my own criteria. But that's the challenge, is getting back on the horse. Back on the horse, the Kabbalists, that's Latin for horse. And so when you get into horse sense, then you're getting into the deeper underlying connectivity that is a part of the world in which we live. And when you start looking into that, you get to a point where it's too easy to try and resolve things and say, aha, I figured out what group it is. When actually the time in which we're living now is more freewheeling than any time we lived, in a way, except for those that are happy to dwell in the hive mind. But that being said, there is many organizations that participate in this thraldom in which the people of the world are captivated by. But there's more and more people that are able to try and develop another narrative that provides more pieces to the puzzle. So that's what I tried to do. And in getting into understanding some of the history, I thought I would get into this with Christopher, but he's nowhere to be found thus far. And I hope he doesn't think that I sent you a link. Oh, he's saying, are you going to send a link? Okay, well, I'll send it. Excuse me for a moment while I send him a link via a different pathway. I sent him an email, but apparently that didn't get him there. Okay, where is it? Sorry about this. Okay. There, he should be with us shortly. Isn't that interesting? You thought of everything, and there's again yet another open set. You didn't think of everything. And so that's my point. So the world just made my point for me. Is the challenge of being able to widen your gaze, to get in all the peripheral aspects of it, and then to try and assess what you're looking at without having your comprehension swayed by sympathy or antipathy. That's where you'll find objective clarity. And that used to be what news journalists, that's what they used to pride themselves in. Although those days, as we could see, are long past us, and we might hope that they would come again. Well, in getting into some of this, while he's getting ready to log on, I should point towards a few things that might be of interest. Here's a book that's very interesting. The only problem is being able to connect some of the concepts that he comes up with, Dr. John Coleman, regarding the 300. He calls it the Committee of the 300. So it's this large group of power. And ultimately, here, I see Chris. Oh, we may not have a picture here. We'll see. Okay, it's okay. Are you there, Chris? Well, I got a picture. hopefully. And so anyways, that is an overview book that's very, very useful. What's most well known is the information provided by Carroll Quigley, the professor of history at Georgetown University and mentor of Bill Clinton. His Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. And actually, I recommend more strongly is The Anglo-American Establishment by Carroll Quigley, because it gets down to it. And it says our devices are not connected. Well, he's having trouble logging on. That's unfortunate. Maybe I should call him and talk him through it. But well, he's going to use his phone to do it, so I guess that's not a good idea. Well, let's see. Sorry about this, folks. Yeah, I think I just forced him. That was a bad connection anyway, so he'll try again. Okay, so anyways, where was I? Okay, so if anybody wants to look at it from the side of how the American establishment is connected to the British establishment, this is a good introduction. But problem being, Carroll Quigley was given access to certain papers, and some of what's most interesting about what he discusses is that it's what he doesn't talk about. Isn't that always the case? And if I dig around over here, I shouldn't have put it on the bottom of the pile, but I did. Excuse me. There we go. Okay. But in this book here, this is a limited printing of around 750 or so copies. A Parliament of the Press. The First Imperial Press Conference by Thomas Hardman. And it's got a preface by the Right Honorable Earl of Rosebery, who at one time was Prime Minister of England for a little more than a year. And he was married to Hannah de Rothschild, the richest woman in Great Britain at that time. And of course, the daughter of the leading representative of the Rothschild family in England at that time. And she inherited his fortune. And she didn't live much longer after that. And so he inherited that fortune in addition to the fortune that he came with. And so say, well, why bring that up? Well, it's quite interesting because that the research that we've done over at American Intelligence Media and Americans for Innovation, we keep looking into the people involved in this. And essentially what this was a conference of journalists, people from all the various news services throughout the British Empire. And the British Empire at that time was attempting to transform itself from an empire into a commonwealth. And so it's still serving under the Commonwealth status, and there's a variation of the types of agreements that the nations have relative to the Commonwealth. And in light of that, in here is very interesting. And in fact, I'm learning new stuff all the time because I received a communication from somebody whose grandfather from the Glasgow Evening News in Scotland, who was at the conference, and he recalled back when his grandfather and his father would talk about this German individual that just showed up there. And his name was Gottfried Schwab, and he's like the grandfather, he's a grandfather of Karl Schwab, Klaus Schwab who's now Switzerland, but they're a German family. And so that's very, very interesting in that he's not listed in the book, although this individual's grandfather is listed in this book. And so that's a little piece to the puzzle, because that's really a core item as regards to the current events. And you show the continuity going back to the first Imperial press conference of 1909, and that is a real key. He's having trouble with his phone. Well, so I'll continue on. And so I'm reading something. Okay. So if you get into this and you start trying to determine how this affects us, you get down to the topic of city-states. And these are corporate entities that are functioning in a particular capacity, which is very interesting in its development, because if you get into it, and I was looking around here, I have a 2-volume set of the letters and writings of Sir Henry Mainwaring. And he was a privateer, at times a pirate, who was at times in service of the crown, at times just on his own. And so you look at that and you see that if you understand corporate law is a function that is developed out of maritime law, which is the law of the sea. And so at that time, back in the 1600s, when there was war going on with Spain, that you had this difficult situation for the crown to be able to finance this warfare. And they came up with a strategy. Well, why don't we just provide letters of marque to captains of sailing ships? Letters of marque gives them permission to function as a privateer in service of the crown, and whatever booty they get, they can keep and kick back a percentage to the crown. And so that worked really well for them, to say the least, so that they were able to overcome Spain in the conflict, and they were also able to develop a certain strategy, and that strategy continued on and became more developed in a global capacity. And so you have, the developments coming out of the Netherlands with this is covered in the book of Dutch Ships in Tropical Waters, the development of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, and the shipping network in Asia, 1595 to 1660. And so in this book, Robert Parthesius, who wrote it, realized after observing the own records of the official records that are present in the libraries in Amsterdam. Mind you, that's a scholarly publication that's totally based on sources. And it turns out that the Dutch East India Company was approximately twice as large as people had ever thought. And so you get into that and you realize them and the parallel organization, the East India Company out of Britain, that these corporations developed. It was developed after the Venetian model, and the city of Venice is very significant in that regard, in that out of there, through their concept of city-states with the breakdown of the Holy Roman Empire and all of that, and it developed into this complicated nest of, here he is, complicated nest of interests. And within that, Venice is very singular in that it was such a maritime power, and it had developed through the all the way back and through the Crusades. They would hire out ships to ship soldiers and whole armies to the Middle East for the Crusades and things of that nature. Oh, his device just dropped off. And so it's very developed, but they had a way of doing things that was basically resurrected. That's very interesting, and I think that Christopher here should be able to add a lot of details regarding the role of the Italian city-states in developing the corporate model. Are you there, Chris? Yeah? Well, we need a little sound. A little tiny picture there. Okay. I'm still not hearing anything. And so I'll keep talking. And Chris, if you get your sound up and running, we'll just keep talking. And when it kicks on, it'll kick on. But in any event, so in understanding the whole idea of how this Romanism is essentially what it is, because it's a thought structure based on legalism. Now, when you go through the history of the church, you see that they have the church fathers, and there are two different branches of the church fathers. There's the Roman church fathers and the Eastern church. The Eastern church were essentially philosophers, whereas the Western church, they were lawyers, essentially. And so it became a legalistic system of structures and treaties and all of that leads very significantly. He's gone again. It says his device is not. Here he is. Try it again. And so, you there? Well, if you get it up and running, just start talking, and we'll take it from there. So, the Venetians were very instrumental in affecting the way things were done in Amsterdam and in London, which are very key period cities in that period. But the whole concept of the incorporation of the city-state, that really goes back even earlier. I mean, there's so many different rabbit holes we could duck down here. And for me, it's interesting. For somebody else, maybe it's akin to watching paint dry. But I assume that if you're here listening to this, you're not one of them. But in any regards, you had the whole idea of the way things developed culturally from the coastlines of the nations of Europe. And that's a real key in the way in which power and money developed in trade. And that was really the basis of the modernization of economies. And through this milieu was developed the whole idea of creating corporate structures that provided a legal framework to function within essentially what it was rooted in was maritime law. And but going through a lot of different transformations and being able to adapt to the circumstances, it provided a vehicle for government entities like the British Empire, for example. Their empire was created in large part through the activities of the East India Company, which is a private company. And they had their own standing army, which was larger than the standing army in England. And in fact, it was all over the world, right? And so when you get into understanding what really went on, it's difficult because if you want to find these details, you really have to do the work, because the typical history courses that are taught in education are not providing you with that type of information, because those history courses are very much tied into the impulses that came out of the First Imperial press conference. And so you have, and also the later develop out of the Frankfurt School. Just recently in the Holocaust website, I found correspondence linking the heads of the Holocaust Remembrance Memorial in their links to the Frankfurt group out of the Johann Wolfgang von Goethe Institute, which is very interesting because it's the Johann Wolfgang Goethe Universität. And it was founded in 1914 with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the great poet I talk about a great deal, at the university in Frankfurt am Main. And it's one of the largest universities in Germany. But it's internationally known for social research and home of the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School is associated largely with Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. But then there's also Jürgen Habermas, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, and Walter Benjamin. And this group of individuals that came to the United States and have really developed this postmodern leftist perspective in our universities. And here they have the correspondence with the philosopher, Professor Dr. Norbert Altwicker, regarding the Loeb Lectures, which is an interdisciplinary series of lectures on history, philosophy, and religion of the Jewish people. And Alfred Wiener suggests potential lectures for the series. And there's program leaflets and all that. So this is on the soutron.net. That's soutron.net. And it's the Wiener, WIENER.soutron.net. If you go on there, you're going to find all kinds of interesting correspondence. And so I guess the point I want to make is that the kind of research I do and my associates, we like to work with the actual documents and see what that does for us instead of trying to get off into the rushes with all kinds of theories. So let's just let the research lead us there and see where it takes us. Is there anything there from Chris? No sound? I don't have him muted. No? Okay, well, I don't know. But anyway, I'll just keep talking until he figures out his technical issue. And if it doesn't work out, well, we can always do it some other time. But so you get into this undertow of corporatism and the way in which to consolidate power. And with Christopher, what I wanted to get into was understanding New York, because New York is so important in understanding the way in which that developed and the whole ties to both London and Amsterdam, because in its early stages, New York was New Amsterdam, and it remained the main location of the people of power and influence from Amsterdam in the United States, and very much tied into Alexander Hamilton, who actually married into one of the wealthy families from the Netherlands that were in New York at the time, and tying into the Stuyvesants and all these names that most people really have never heard of, but that are unbelievably significant in American history. But when you get into this and you start to research it, it's difficult because you come up with the concept that is usually considered terminology. And terminology is sometimes a tool to obfuscate. It's a tool to obscure. And so the name game is a favorite way in which, for example, corporate entities, they deal with scenarios in which they're confronted with. Because if, for example, if a corporate entity gets involved in a lawsuit, they can shut down that corporation and open up another one. It's like mushrooms, you know. So, and you have these layers and layers of corporations. Like, for example, when they were getting rid of slavery in the United States. Now, slavery and the drug trade, opium trade, was one of the primary sources of revenue, for example, for Harvard University. They have the largest endowment at the current time for the whole country of any college. But the foundation of that endowment was on the slave trade and the drug trade, the opium trade from the Orient. But in order to get around those hurdles, they would create corporate entities that would have dealings with other corporate entities, and so they could like distance themselves from their activities to protect them legally. And so that's what was happening at the time. And of course, I'm not going to hone in on just that particular detail, although it is very, very interesting. But below I posted some relevant documents that give you just a piece in which to gain a deeper insight into what we're talking about here, because included in there is the deal that was put together, and I want to bring it up before me here because it's really quite an interesting find that was made by my associates over at Americans for Innovation and Michael McKibben and that whole group that has been doing such remarkable research. Now, if I can get to my channel and get to my notes and not have the sound go on. There. Okay. So we have here that N.M. Rothschild and his brother-in-law, who was a broker, Sir Moses Montefiore, brokered the loan to Parliament from 1835 to 1838 to compensate for the losses of slaves by British subjects, and founding the offshore banking British system used to this day to finance war and in all manner of curious things. But we have open source House of Commons parliamentary paper. And so that link is there. You can link onto the PDF that is posted over at Americans for Innovation. And you can look into it and see the massive amount of money that was doled out to buy people out. But in the same turn of events, the Rothschilds were able to create a debt service. And that's the key to understand, is understanding how debt service is used as a tool of control. And so that very much enabled them to insert their interests very deeply into the British government by, yeah, sure, we'll own you the money. And, and so they're like right in the mix. And N.M. Rothschild, that's the family of Hunter of Rothschild, it's all so close together. And ultimately, that's a real key for understanding this. And so when you get into it and you start digging around, you come up with key individuals like Lord Chatham. And Lord Rosebery wrote the biography, the definitive biography of Lord Chatham. And of course, after Lord Chatham is the becoming quite well-known Chatham House. And the Chatham House rules are the rules of meetings whereby no notes are made of who said what, so that the people can confidently speak freely. Of course, there's no media there that aren't members of Chatham House. And so a lot of interesting that goes on, and there are reports that are put out by them to give their opinion on things. And so you see that there's this interesting nexus of power in Britain, because the way in which they have things set up is that there's committees. And the committees in Parliament are the organizations within Parliament that make determinations regarding what's to be accomplished. And so in light of that, it's important to understand that the only one that knows who's on the committees is the Queen. So that's kind of interesting. Kind of a narrow highway of information. And there's very late at night, very early in the morning, an automobile shows up at the palace and drops off these red boxes. And within the red boxes are contained the correspondence that are from the Privy Council or the committees. And that is how she stays on top of her interests. And Polly, there's a little comment by my friend in Amsterdam. The first bank in Amsterdam was opened in 1609 by the Rothschilds in the House of Orange. Yeah. In any event, where are we here? Okay. I'm still trying to get Chris on here. Are you there, Chris? Well, this is the Where's Chris show. So when you get into understanding this, and you see that it's a question of leverage through loans and the debt slavery is what you could call it. And so that was a very important aspect of what happened after the Revolutionary War. And so you see that at the end of the Revolutionary War, the various states of these United States, the continental states that were involved in the Continental Congress, they had different corporate agreements that they were functioning under. And this connected them to the crown. And so many people don't realize it, but when the war ended, it was the general of the British forces that surrendered. The king never surrendered. You have to keep that in mind, so that it's quite a confusing issue, because the more you look into the actual documentation of the period, and you see that the crown still retained its sovereignty over the trade routes in the oceans and even up into the waterways that came off of the ocean, so that there was this continual presence, and that there was the debt service of the various corporate entities of the colonies that were owed to the crown. And so there was this connection, and it's continued on. It's kind of like a barnacle in the side of liberty here that's been there. And it's interesting because when you get into who managed to work out the deal regarding that debt, and it goes back to Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. And I was, again, hoping that Chris could be here, and he has a great deal of detail on that, but if this just ends up being introductory to our next talk, that's okay too, but it sure would be nice. And so, where was I? Okay, so that if you get into understanding to what extent is freedom free, and that's what we're looking at here. And we have this whole idea that we think that we're functioning as free American citizens, private citizens, under the status that we had before 1933. But in 1933, there was a shift in the dynamics of government and economics in the United States, and the status of the citizenry was transformed, and they became the basis of the economy from the registration. It's kind of similar. It reminds me of the letters of marque that the pirates would get from the king so they could be privateers, except that in the case of this here, you have birth certificates that you don't possess, that you're just the entity occupying that name. And it has to do with the name stealing is an interesting concept that's presented in a book that's quite controversial, and I like the fact that it's controversial. But the Orlinda book, which is said to be translated from a Frisian manuscript of the 13th century, it was published in a translation with the Frisian original text on facing pages, but that was published back in 1876, and it talks about the way in which certain interests at that time that they were struggling with in Frisia, they were struggling with these outside powers that were attempting to take them over and rule them, but they complained about the way in which these powers worked, is they would usurp names, that they would, for example, proclaim somebody a lady, giving them a deference and nobility when that wasn't the case, and they didn't have the authority to be able to do that. And so you have all this idea, like there's so often the case that you see where they'll say, well, it was like the Knights Templar. That's the one everybody's always poking at the Knights Templar. It's their fault. When the Knights Templar were taken down by Philip le Bel and his puppet pope, and the infrastructure that had been created by the Knights Templar, who really created the first international banking system, in that it's not them. It's that whole idea, name stealing, that has continued on, and the assets were delivered over to the other orders of chivalry at the time. I'm looking, I got so many books around me that, here they are. So you get into some interesting byways, but as it continues down through history, a lot of what people are blaming on the Knights Templar had to do with organizations such as the Knights of St. John in England, which is the British equivalent of the Knights of Malta. The Knights of Malta is an organization out of the Catholic Church, and if you're a member of the Knights of Malta, you get a diplomatic passport. Well, that's really handy, because what that means is that you can travel through airports and not be searched, and so they can carry all manner of things that the ordinary individual couldn't carry. Somebody's saying in's a bar. Well, yeah, of course. Here's the history of the Temple, London, from the institution of the Order of the Knights of the Temple to the close of the Stuart period by J. Bruce Williamson. And this is from 1924. And in here, what this is you're talking about the early development of the legal system in England that came out of what those became were the inns of law, essentially, the inns of bar. is what it is. And the Inns of Bar, when you join the bar, you get a title. You become an esquire. Even in the U.S., by the way, the United States Bar Association it's an organization of the British Bar Association, so that when you become a lawyer in the United States and you join the bar, you're joining the British, and you're given a title. And so that gets kind of squirrely because there's conflicting loyalties there, and you get a lot of individuals in government that are Knights of Malta, for example. So they have divided loyalties because they take an oath to the Pope. I mean, what is that? I thought you were going to be an American politician, and here you are serving the Pope. And so that's kind of a violation of the law of nations, the Vatel. That's a very important work regarding treaties. But in getting into this legal system in England, there's probably no better source than the book, The English Constitution, which is really kind of a strange title because they don't have a constitution. But this is Legal Classics Library, privately printed edition. It's the English Constitution of Walter Bagehot. And within this book is an attempt to explain the structure of the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and the cabinet and the monarchy, and how that supposedly has checks and balances. But there's certain things that in the real world you might question that gives you a clear picture, because the autonomy that is held by the crown is, I mean, unbelievable. And I guess it becomes increasingly relevant at this time because it doesn't look that Queen Elizabeth is going to be on the throne for very long. And so the incumbent is Prince Charles. And he has, in my mind, some dicey associations. And so it doesn't look good, and when you get into it, and by the way, if you want to look more closely at some of the things that I'm discussing, you can go to my Twitter feed at John Barnwell 888, and you can see parked up at the top, I have the Crown Gate thread, and there I give the details regarding so much of this, names, faces, and I have links to primary documents, and it's something that it was really interesting at the time, and it kind of showed me how Twitter worked, because I posted it, and over a period of a few weeks, I got 2.5 million impressions. And I could go in my back room and see the graph on it. And then all of a sudden, it dropped down to next to nothing. And I don't get that much action there now, but I think there's more action than they report, And so it's interesting how this goes. I mean, I've done videos in my podcast here, and I'll look and it will say that there's, 200 people watching. And then it drops, or have watched, and then it drops down to 187. It's like, I mean, I'm flattered that they would be concerned enough to change the count on my humble podcast. But in any regard, I think that it becomes an interesting way of getting things out. So if you want to get some of the details from it, you can do that through at John Barnwell 888 over on Twitter. A good source to get a grounding in the European experience of history is Alexis de Tocqueville's two volumes set, Democracy in America. And it's interesting that it is an outsider that really gives the most developed examination of the American system And but this particular edition had the additional interest of that it has the critical appraisal of each volume by John Stuart Mill, who was a very, very significant person in a British culture. And I mentioned him on occasion on my podcast with David. And there's also Jardin's biography of Alexis de Tocqueville. And so there's some really interesting sources that if you can get them under your belt will give you a chance to look more deep under the hood and see what's really driving things, because it's not what you seem to think in most instances. That's the way I look at it. You think, oh, the simple answer is usually the best one, except when it comes to corporations. And so I don't know if we're going to see my friend here, and that's okay. I'll just talk a little bit, and I'll reschedule for another day with him. While I'm here, I might as well mention that I have 2 books I've written. My first book is some 640 pages. That's the Arcana of the Grail Angel, the Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And it has a foreword by my best buddy, Douglas Gabriel of American Intelligence Media, has great many diagrams, and I reproduced the whole series of diagrams in my second book, plus add a great many more, and they actually take up almost half the book. There's so many diagrams. But these books are available. This is Arcana of Light on the Path. It's more of a meditative tool. They're both available on eBay, or if you're outside the US, you can contact me directly through my academia link below or through private message on Facebook. And so that's that. And if you want to buy me a cup of coffee, that's paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. And that's much appreciated. And I want to acknowledge the wonderful individuals that have been supportive of me and my adventure here and various podcasts. There's Tyla and Vadim and Vivian and Neil and Christian and Mark and Maud and Drewman and Laura and Paula and Rick and Michael and many, many other people. And I think that I like to think that this is important, that we get this information out here. And I also want to highlight some other things I posted you might be wondering about, but I've posted some open source PDFs. There's John Buchan from December 17, 1917, Secret, a Psychological Offensive, to be launched at a well-selected psychological moment. And that's from the National Archives in the UK, and it's the strategy of psychological offensive. And there's also open source FISA PDF on the UK-US Communications Intelligence Agreement from 1955. And I put in a link for the Orlinda book, which is interesting. And so that's some of the things that you can dig in there with. And I don't think we're going to be seeing Chris today, and that's okay. Like I said, we will reschedule. But if you want to come to an understanding of what they had in mind, it has to do with, well, at the time it was about the National Food and Reform Association, and there's comments in here by Lord Rosebery and rearing an imperial race. And there's references in here to eugenics and the whole thing. So they really had a lot on their plate. They had big plans for you. But meanwhile, in meeting all of that, there's an excellent book, Saving the Constitution by Richard Proctor. And that's an excellent book. If you want to find out what's supposed to be happening. And so I guess, since I've covered a little bit of ground, gave you a footing in some of the reference materials, I think that maybe I should just sign off here and reschedule. But I don't want to forget to make reference to the real steering committee. That's the Pilgrim Society. And here's their official US book and their official British book. And they are, we might have them. You there? But anyways, so I think I'm not getting this off the ground as a conversation, but like I said, I'm more than capable of going on. And today is just a book show and tell. And so I'll just show a little more. Here's the biography of Lord Rosebery by Lord Crewe, his good buddy. And what's interesting in here is there's absolutely no mention of the Imperial Press Conference, but yet it was Lord Rosebery and Henry de Worms, who's Rothschild on his mother and his father's side, but he converted to Anglican. And so that's interesting. The Anglican Church, the Church of England, as some people refer to it. And also Lord Rosebery was a member of that, the High Church Party of the Church of England. And so many of the things that people are accusing certain groups of, when you look into it, you say, well, actually, they defected. They're not in that group anymore, or are they? And so there's all these gray areas that you have to be very tenuous in looking into. And Lord Rosebery had his fall, and here's a play-by-play from the diary of Sir Edward Hamilton, 1894 to 1895. And Lord Rosebery had his problems. He only managed to pull off being the prime minister for a little more than a year. And so it's actually quite an exciting storyline, and there's a lot of cast of characters and significant figures pulled out of the equation through the sinking of the Titanic. How far one wants to go with why that is so, it's hard to say. When I grew up in Detroit, we had this couple living across the street from us, and they were supposed to be on the Titanic, but they missed it. And so I guess that's a good thing. But there's so much going on that we can only touch a little bit at a time. And so, given that we've spent a nice hour together and I've given you some things to look for, and mind you, a lot of the books, especially the older books that I'm talking about, they're available on academia. I frequently tend to put links, but I also tend to pull in books that I wasn't intended to, so I didn't get around to the links. But if you just look up the titles on academia.org, you'll find many of them. And it's interesting because, for example, with Lord Rosebery, the 2-volume set by his probably closest friend, and there's no mention in the Imperial Press Conference, and here he was the keynote speaker, and it was financed by Burroughs Wellcome, which was the largest chemical/pharma company in the UK or Britain at that. It really was still Britain at that time, and they now have gone through metamorphosis, and continual metamorphosis, but still the Wellcome Trust is the largest, one of the, if not the largest medical trust in the world. And so you have a lot of these things. It's the same old, same old. You look and you go, it's not, why is it always the same people? Well, it's as George Carlin says, it's a big club and you ain't in it. So I think that with that can give us something to depart on and in good stead. And I'll get together with my good friend Christopher Earl Strunk, a brilliant guy I get to talk to a lot. It's a shame that you couldn't eavesdrop, but I was hoping you could eavesdrop on one of our fascinating conversations. But in that regard, and I'll be back next Sunday with Reverend David. He's been busy. He's getting boosted up in the Church of Antioch to be an archbishop. He's a bishop already, but he's going to be an archbishop. And I guess they gave him a new ring and everything. So that's good for him, and I'm happy for him. And that's always interesting talking to him. And I look forward to talking to Chris Strunk in the near future. And so to all of you, I want to thank you for stopping by. And yeah, if you feel moved, buy me a cup of coffee.